In 1933, a prairie grandmother fed her family of 10 on 11 cents a day. No electricity, no refrigerator, just a wood stove, a root cellar, and the kind of knowledge grocery stores spent the next century trying to erase. Number 18 on this list was invented by Newfoundland women who received government salt cod. They had no idea how to cook. Number 7 uses a trick so simple that modern chefs now charge $40 a plate for it. These 30 dinners kept Canadian families alive through the dirty 30s, when drought turned the prairies to dust and a bag of flour meant the difference between eating and going without. Subscribe, because what your grandmother knew about feeding a crowd on nothing might be exactly what you need right now. Number 30, bread and dripping sandwiches. When the roast was gone and payday was still a week away, your grandmother scraped the cooled fat from the roasting pan, spread it across a thick slice of homemade bread, and sprinkled it with salt. That was supper. In the early 1930s, a pound of beef cost around 15 cents in Ontario, and families made every molecule of that purchase last. The dripping was saved in a tin can on the back of the stove, sometimes layered brown and white from different roasts, and rationed out across the week. Children came home from school to bread and dripping waiting on the kitchen table. Nobody complained. There was nothing else. The beefy flavor carried the ghost of Sunday dinner into Thursday night. When margarine became cheap in the 1950s, the dripping tin disappeared from Canadian kitchens almost overnight. But for a generation raised on prairie dust and empty cupboards, bread and dripping was not poverty food. It was survival, spread thin and salted. Number 29, potato soup. When the root cellar was half empty and the garden was still weeks from producing, potato soup anchored the table. Your grandmother peeled 6 or 7 potatoes, diced an onion, and simmered everything in water with a bay leaf and whatever scraps of salt pork she could find. The potatoes broke down into a thick, starchy broth that filled bellies without emptying the pantry. A splash of canned milk stirred in at the end gave it richness. In Saskatchewan, during the worst drought years of 1934 and 1935, potatoes were sometimes the only crop that survived. Families ate potato soup 3 and 4 nights a week. Children dunked crusts of bread into the bowl, scraping every last drop. No cream, no butter. Just potatoes, water, and the quiet determination to make it through another week. Number 28, fried bologna. A quarter pound of bologna cost 5 cents at the general store, making it one of the cheapest proteins available during the Depression. Your grandmother sliced it thick, scored the edges so it would not curl, and fried it in a hot cast iron skillet until the edges crisped and browned. Served between 2 slices of bread with mustard, or alongside fried potatoes and onions, it was a full meal for a family of 6. The smell of frying bologna meant supper was 5 minutes away. Children fought over the crispiest slices. Bologna was the great equalizer of Depression-era Canada. Rich or poor, city or farm, everyone knew the taste of fried bologna on a Tuesday night. Number 27, PEA soup. Dried split peas cost almost nothing and stored forever in the pantry. Your grandmother soaked a pound overnight, then simmered them all day with a ham bone, an onion, and a couple of carrots until the soup turned thick enough to hold a spoon upright. That single ham bone, bought for pennies or saved from a holiday meal, flavored pot after pot across the winter. In Quebec, pea soup was practically a religion, served with hunks of bread and sometimes a splash of vinegar. Across the prairies and the Maritimes, every grandmother had her own version. The pot sat on the back of the wood stove from morning until evening. One pot fed 10 people. Leftovers thickened overnight into something you could slice. Nobody threw away pea soup. It just became tomorrow's lunch. Number 26, cornmeal mush. When flour ran low and bread was a luxury, cornmeal mush took its place. Your grandmother stirred cornmeal into boiling, salted water, cooking it until thick, then served it hot with milk or molasses poured over top. The leftover mush was poured into a loaf pan, cooled until solid, sliced, and fried in lard the next morning. Crispy on the outside, soft and warm inside. A 5-pound bag of cornmeal cost 10 cents in 1932 and lasted a family 2 weeks. It stuck to your ribs and kept you going through cold mornings and long walks to the schoolhouse. Number 25. Creamed eggs on toast for families. 6 eggs, a tablespoon of flour, a cup of milk, and 4 slices of toast fed a family of 8 for supper. Your grandmother hard-boiled the eggs, chopped them, and folded them into a simple white sauce seasoned with salt and pepper. Spooned over toast, it was filling, cheap, and ready in 15 minutes. On farms where chickens provided a steady supply of eggs, even when cash was non-existent, creamed eggs appeared on the table 2 or 3 times a week. The dish asked nothing fancy of the cook, just a steady hand with the sauce and enough bread to go around. Number 24. Boiled dinner. A single piece of salt pork or a cheap cut of beef went into a heavy pot with potatoes, carrots, turnips, cabbage, and onions. Everything boiled together for hours until the meat was tender and the vegetables had soaked up every ounce of flavor. In the Maritimes, boiled dinner was a Saturday tradition, anchored by whatever the garden and the general store could provide. A 2-pound piece of salt pork cost 15 cents and fed the entire family, with leftovers for Sunday. The broth alone was a meal, sopped up with bread or drunk from a mug. Children were served the softest vegetables first. Fathers got the meat. Mothers took whatever remained. That quiet hierarchy at the table said everything about how Depression-era families survived. Everyone ate. Nobody ate more than their share. Number 23. Baked beans. Your grandmother soaked navy beans overnight, then baked them all day in a crock with molasses, salt pork, mustard, and onion. The kitchen filled with a sweet, smoky smell that drew children to the table hours before supper was ready. A pound of dried beans cost 5 cents and expanded into enough food to feed 10 people. In New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, baked beans with brown bread on Saturday night was a tradition so deeply rooted that skipping it felt like breaking a commandment. The beans came out dark and thick, the molasses having caramelized into a sticky glaze. Leftover beans went into sandwiches, were reheated for breakfast, or stretched into soup. The bean pot sat on the counter like a promise. As long as it was full, nobody went hungry. Number 22. Head cheese. Your grandmother simmered a pig's head with onions, vinegar, and pickling spice for hours until the meat fell apart. She picked every scrap of flesh from the skull, chopped it fine, mixed it back into the reduced cooking liquid, and poured the whole thing into a mold to set overnight. The next day, she sliced it cold onto bread with mustard. In rural Ontario and Quebec, head cheese was a winter staple, made during the fall pig butchering when nothing from the animal could be wasted. A single pig's head, worth almost nothing at the butcher's counter, became a week of cold suppers. When supermarkets replaced farm butchering, head cheese vanished from most Canadian tables within a generation. Number 21. Mock apple pie. When apples were out of season or too expensive, your grandmother made pie from soda crackers. She soaked the crackers in a syrup of water, sugar, cream of tartar, and cinnamon until they softened into something that tasted remarkably like cooked apples. Baked in a pastry crust, the filling fooled nearly everyone at the table. The recipe appeared in Canadian newspapers throughout the 1930s. A box of soda crackers cost a nickel. The illusion was almost perfect. Children ate their slices and asked for more, never suspecting they were eating crackers instead of apples. Number 20. Salt cod cakes. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. During the worst years of the Depression, the Newfoundland government shipped barrels of salt cod to prairie families as food relief. The problem was that most prairie women had never seen salt cod in their lives and had no idea what to do with it. But the women who figured it out created something extraordinary. Your grandmother soaked the stiff, salty planks of fish overnight. She shredded the softened flesh, mixed it with mashed potatoes, onion, and an egg, shaped the mixture into patties, and fried them until golden in lard. The result was crispy, savory, and filling. In Newfoundland and the Maritimes, cod cakes had been a tradition for generations, but on the prairies, they became a symbol of adaptation. Women who had never lived near the ocean learned to cook the sea. A single pound of salt cod, stretched with potatoes, fed a family for 2 meals. Number 19. Bread. Pudding. Stretching stale bread. Stale bread was never thrown away in a Depression kitchen. Your grandmother tore it into chunks, soaked it in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla, then baked it until golden and custardy. Raisins or whatever dried fruit the pantry held went in too. Served warm with a pour of canned milk, bread pudding turned waste into dessert. The whole pudding cost almost nothing and fed the family a sweet ending to a meal that may have been nothing but soup. Children loved it. Mothers made it with the quiet pride of women who understood that throwing away food was a sin, worse than any the preacher warned about. Number 18. Jig's Dinner. In Newfoundland, Jig's Dinner was the Sunday ritual that held communities together through the hardest years. Salt beef, soaked overnight to draw out the brine, was boiled with cabbage, potatoes, turnip, carrots, and peas pudding. A dense yellow cake of split peas tied in a cloth bag and cooked alongside the meat. The entire meal came from one pot. The broth, called pot liquor, was saved and drunk on its own or used as the base for the next day's soup. Salt beef cost next to nothing, preserved in brine, and sold from barrels at the merchant's shop. The smell of Jig's Dinner boiling away on Sunday morning drifted through outport kitchens from St. John's to the Northern Peninsula. Every family claimed their version was the proper one. Arguments about whether to add parsnips could last decades. Number 17. Macaroni and tomato. A box of macaroni cost 5 cents. A tin of tomatoes cost 7 cents. Together, they fed 6 people a hot supper in 20 minutes. Your grandmother boiled the macaroni, drained it, stirred in the canned tomatoes, added salt, pepper, and a lump of butter if she had it. In mining towns across northern Ontario and Cape Breton, macaroni and tomato appeared on the table so often that children grew up believing it was a national dish. The sweet acidity of the tomatoes soaked into the pasta. It was not elegant, but it was warm, filling, and ready before the children finished their homework. When Kraft Dinner arrived in Canadian stores in 1937, it slowly replaced the homemade version. But the tinned tomato had a depth of flavor the powdered cheese could never match. Number 16. Oatmeal soup. Second pattern break. When the cupboard held nothing but oats and an onion, your grandmother made soup. She browned the onion in a bit of dripping, added water, and stirred in rolled oats until the broth thickened into something warm and sustaining. A pinch of salt, a crack of pepper. That was dinner. On the prairies during the drought years, oatmeal soup kept families alive when there was literally nothing else in the house. Oats were cheap, available through relief programs, and filling enough to get a family through the night. Children ate it without knowing how close the family was to having nothing at all. Your grandmother served it with a steady hand and a calm face, hiding the worry that lived behind her eyes every single day of the 1930s. Number 15. Fried potatoes and onions. This was the meal that saved more Canadian families than any government program. When there was no meat, no tinned goods, and no flour for bread, there were potatoes and onions in the root cellar. Your grandmother sliced both thin, fried them in lard or bacon grease in a cast iron skillet, and served them on tin plates with nothing but salt. The potatoes crisped golden at the edges while the onions caramelized, sweet and soft. Prairie families ate fried potatoes and onions 4 or 5 nights a week during the worst years. Nobody called it a recipe. It was just what you did when the cupboard was bare and mouths still needed feeding. Number 14, rabbit stew. On the prairies and in rural Ontario, rabbit was free meat for anyone willing to set a snare. Your grandmother skinned the rabbit, jointed it, browned the pieces in lard, and simmered them with potatoes, carrots, and onions until the meat fell from the bone. One rabbit stretched with root vegetables fed a family of 8. Children set the snares and felt pride when they contributed to supper. Fathers showed them where to look for rabbit runs along fence lines and at the edges of sloughs. When cheap chicken became available after the war, rabbit vanished from most tables within a decade. Number 13, dumplings in everything. When the stew was thin and the meat was scarce, dumplings made the difference between a meal and a mouthful. Your grandmother mixed flour, baking powder, salt, and a spoonful of lard, dropped the dough in rough spoonfuls onto the simmering pot, covered it tight, and let the steam do the work. In 15 minutes, the dumplings swelled fat and tender, soaking up broth and stretching a meager stew into something that actually filled the stomach. A cup of flour cost almost nothing, but the dumplings turned watery soup into a proper dinner. Everyone knew the rule. Lift the lid, kill the dumpling. Number 12. Creamed canned salmon. A tin of pink salmon cost 15 cents in 1934, and it became the centerpiece of a meal from Vancouver to Halifax. Your grandmother flaked the fish into a white sauce made from flour, butter, and milk, and served it over toast, biscuits, or boiled potatoes. The soft bones in the canned salmon were eaten and provided calcium that children desperately needed. The sauce stretched a small tin into enough food for 6 or 7 people. In British Columbia, canned salmon was just practical. In the prairies, pulling that tin from the shelf meant payday was still days away. Number 11, meatless stew. Long before it became a modern trend, meatless meals were simply reality for Depression families who could not afford protein every day. Your grandmother filled the pot with whatever vegetables were available and simmered them in water seasoned with salt, pepper, and a bay leaf. Sometimes she thickened the broth with a handful of barley. The stew was plain but hot. Served with thick slices of bread, it filled every seat. Nobody called it a philosophy. They called it Wednesday. Number 10, tourtière. Third pattern break. In Quebec, tourtière was more than a meat pie. It was the dish that proved a family could still celebrate, even when celebrations seemed impossible. Your grandmother mixed ground pork with potatoes, onions, savory, cloves, and cinnamon, packed the filling into a lard pastry crust, and baked it until golden and fragrant. During the Depression, the pork was stretched with extra potato and breadcrumbs, the spices measured carefully because replacing them meant spending money that did not exist. The smell of tourtière baking filled the kitchen with warmth and spice, a signal that despite everything, there was still something good coming out of the oven. Families passed the recipe down through generations, each one adjusting the blend and guarding it like a secret. The crust had to be flaky, the filling had to be seasoned right, and there had to be enough for seconds, even if it meant adding more potato to the mix. Number 9, molasses on bread. When there was no dripping, no butter, and no jam, there was molasses. Your grandmother poured a thick ribbon of blackstrap molasses onto bread and handed it to the children. It was sweet, dark, and rich in iron. A tin of molasses cost 10 cents and lasted weeks. In the Maritimes and across rural Quebec, molasses on bread was as common as breathing. Children came home from school and ate it standing at the counter. Molasses stained fingers and lips dark brown. Nobody minded. It was the sugar of the poor, and it kept an entire generation going. Number 8, bannock. Fourth pattern break. On Indigenous and Métis tables, and across settler homesteads alike, bannock was the bread of survival. Your grandmother mixed flour, baking powder, salt, and lard, shaped the dough into a flat round, and fried it in a skillet or baked it in the oven. No yeast meant no waiting. Bannock was ready in 20 minutes and could be made with ingredients that cost almost nothing. In northern communities and on the prairies, bannock replaced store-bought bread when money ran out entirely. It was dense, filling, and perfect for sopping up stew or spreading with whatever was available. Torn apart, hot from the pan, steam rising from the soft interior, bannock tasted like home to millions of Canadians who grew up during the 30s. The recipe varied by family. Some added a bit of sugar, others used water instead of milk, but the fundamentals never changed. Flour, fat, heat, that was all you needed to put bread on the table. Number 7, shepherd's pie from scraps. Here is the trick that modern chefs now charge a fortune to replicate. Your grandmother took the leftover roast from Sunday, minced it by hand through a grinder bolted to the kitchen table, mixed it with gravy and whatever cooked vegetables remained, spread it in a baking dish, and topped it with mashed potatoes. She baked it until the top turned golden and the filling bubbled at the edges. The original meat might have been tough, cheap, or barely enough to slice, but ground up, mixed with gravy, and buried under a mountain of mashed potato, it became something entirely new. One small roast became 2 or 3 additional meals. Nothing was wasted. This was the dish that taught a generation that leftovers were not a punishment. They were an opportunity. Number 6, wacky cake. No eggs, no butter, no milk. Your grandmother made chocolate cake anyway. She mixed flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, salt, vegetable oil, vinegar, and water directly in the baking pan. No bowls to wash. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda to create the lift that eggs would normally provide. The cake came out moist, tender, and deeply chocolatey. It cost pennies to make and tasted better than it had any right to. Children licked the pan clean. Mothers smiled, knowing they had pulled off a small miracle with nothing but pantry staples and chemistry. Some families still make it, never realizing they are baking Depression history every time they skip the eggs. Number 5, dandelion green salad. When the garden was not yet producing and store-bought vegetables were beyond reach, your grandmother sent the children out to pick dandelion greens from the yard. The youngest leaves, picked before the plant flowered, were tender and only slightly bitter. She washed them, dressed them with vinegar and a little bacon fat, and served them alongside whatever else was on the table. Free food, growing in every lawn and ditch across the country. Dandelion greens provided vitamins that Depression diets desperately lacked. The sight of children picking dandelions was so common during the 1930s that nobody thought twice about it. Number 4, water pie. This might be the most heartbreaking entry on the list. When there was no fruit, no filling, and barely any sugar, your grandmother made pie from water. She lined a pie plate with pastry, poured in a mixture of water, a few tablespoons of sugar, a knob of butter, flour, and vanilla, and baked it until the filling set into a simple, sweet custard. It was not rich. It was not fancy. But it was pie, and pie meant that someone in the house still cared enough to make something special out of almost nothing. Water pie appeared in church cookbooks across Ontario and the prairies, offered without apology as the dessert of last resort. Children ate their slices and asked if there was more. There usually was not. Number 3, potato pancakes. When leftover mashed potatoes sat in the icebox, your grandmother mixed them with an egg, a spoonful of flour, and a diced onion, then fried spoonfuls in lard until crispy and golden on both sides. The outside shattered when you bit into it. The inside stayed creamy and warm. Children ate 3 or 4 each, and the platter emptied before the last one left the pan. In Ukrainian and Polish communities across the prairies, potato pancakes were tradition long before the Depression, but the 1930s made them universal. Every grandmother, regardless of heritage, learned that leftover potatoes fried in fat could silence a hungry table faster than almost anything else in the kitchen. Number 2, bean soup with ham bone. Your grandmother kept every ham bone, every pork hock, every scrap of smoked meat in a jar in the icebox, waiting for soup day. She simmered those bones with dried white beans, onions, carrots, and celery until the beans turned creamy and the broth turned thick and smoky. One pot lasted the family 3 days. The beans provided protein, the bone provided flavor, and the vegetables provided whatever vitamins they could. In communities across Canada, bean soup with a ham bone was the meal that bridged the gap between paydays. The pot sat on the back of the stove, reheated and served with bread until every last spoonful was gone. Number 1. Flour and water, gravy over bread. At the very bottom of the cupboard, when there was nothing left but flour and water, your grandmother made gravy. She browned a tablespoon of flour in a dry pan, added water slowly while stirring, and cooked it until thickened. Salt, pepper if she had it, a spoonful of dripping if there was any left. Poured over bread, that gravy was supper. It was the meal nobody talked about afterward. The one that appeared on the table in silence, eaten without complaint, cleared without comment. Flour and water gravy over bread was the taste of the absolute edge, the last line between eating and not eating. Yet, millions of Canadian families survived on exactly this during the worst months of the Depression. Mothers served it with steady hands and dry eyes, knowing that tomorrow they would find something, anything, to put in the pot. And they always did. That gravy kept families together through nights when the future looked as thin as the broth on the plate. It was not a recipe, it was an act of will. Try one of these this week. Potato soup, bannock, fried potatoes, and onions. Then come back and tell me your grandmother was wrong. Share which one your family still makes in the comments. These meals deserve to be remembered.